Okay, so now I want to introduce the first of 4 panels of the day, aptly following Keith's presentation on the risk management framework and Chris's opening remarks. This session has a superb lineup of cybersecurity experts and will be moderated by a good friend of the DFSO, David Medine. David's the lead on data protection security at the consultative group to assist the poor, also known as CGAP. David has a very storied career. He was also chairman of the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board appointed by former President Obama. Just a reminder again, if you've joined us, that there won't be any audience questions during this or the following panels, and you can download the bio of the following panel speakers at dfsobservatory.com. There's a download link for the PDF live right now. Over to you, David.
Thanks to the DFS Observatory for this very timely discussion of the relationship between cybersecurity and digital financial services. We have a distinguished panel to discuss this topic. The DFS has proven to be immensely valuable, I think, as Chris earlier pointed out, during the pandemic. The ability to spend money, to send and receive funds in a contactless form is proven to be a health benefit during this crisis. And another benefit, M-Pesa was mentioned earlier, payment services like that, normally funds go from the big city to the countryside. One of the things we're seeing around the world is a reverse of that trend, which is the countryside maintains its agricultural earnings and actually can help their family members and friends in the big city. So I think DFS Digital Financial Services provides some tremendous benefits. One of the things I wonder is whether there's some lessons from the pandemic, which was a low likelihood of a problem arising, but a massive impact that we've all been living through. And I wonder if the same is true for cybersecurity. It's certainly a greater chance of having an impact, but in terms of on a massive level, are we really paying enough attention to the systemic threats that cybersecurity breaches pose? And will the day come when there's a shutdown of the financial system or good parts of it, and we'll wish we had done more? So I think this is a chance to beef up cybersecurity and do more. Do we have my other panelists online? There we go. Great. So I want to turn to the panelists and invite them to give their name, title, and company, and start off the discussion with Leslie on what are the biggest cybersecurity threats to digital financial services.
Hi, everyone. I'm Leslie Go from the World Bank Group as a Senior Technology Advisor. I work at the intersection of technology and policy framework in many areas related to the digital economy. Reflecting on what you just asked around the biggest cybersecurity threats to digital financial services, I would say that it is a systemic risk in the financial sector, possibly a macro critical risk as well, and important in many ways to integrate that into the financial sector surveillance and building resilience in this area. One of the biggest and most common problem is related to unpatched servers and the cyber hygiene associated with the technology maintenance of the systems. But among all those, there are various other examples with phishing attacks during the pandemic, ransomware, DDoS attack in some cases, especially during this critical period, and also various attack vectors related to man-in-the-middle, drive-by, and SQL injections, etc. So I do observe a lot of these interests in these areas during these times, and I think it warrants a critical look at this problem and see how collectively we could address this challenge. Thank you.
Thanks, Leslie. John, do you want to? What is your perspective on the cyber threats that DFS faces? Are you on mute? John, are you on mute?
Yeah. Sorry, I was dialed in on the phone. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Yeah, so hi, Tom Brickey, Senior Vice President, Cybersecurity Evangelist at MasterCard. So as far as the threats, I see two main categories of challenges for the future. New threats being old fraud in new fraud in old ways and old fraud in new ways. So the old fraud in new ways is basically doing fraudsters have always done, but now they have new capabilities. They have AI enhanced capabilities, more automation. In the future of 5G, they have a lot more vectors. The attack surface is widening. And then for new fraud in old ways, it's bad actors using the traditional information networks that we have to achieve non-traditional effects. So it's not just for the loans, it's not just for money. Now it's more disruption, it's misinformation, it's more chaos on a geopolitical scale as opposed to just breaking into financial institutions and taking their money in the future.
We heard a moment ago that money moves at the speed of light. I wonder if fraud moves at warp speed, and that makes it harder to keep up. Any thoughts on more that DFS could be doing to prevent fraud than they currently is taking place? John, I'll just stick with you for a second.
Yes. Well, I think we may talk about this later, but I think partnerships is definitely a key to that because no one organization has all the answers. I'm surprised at how many times you sit down with other groups and just learn from what they've been doing or what they're even thinking about doing. We're tied into a lot of organizations, but my CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, just took over the chair role for the Financial Service Sector Coordinating Council, which is huge because you bring together all the financial partners working with Treasury and DHS and others, and there's a huge need for more information sharing to bring everyone's level higher.
Great, thank you. Katheryn, your thoughts on the threats that cyber poses to DFS?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm Katheryn Rosen. I am at JP Morgan, and I lead our technology and cyber supervisory engagement, as well as our public policy and our partnerships efforts. So John and I could talk for a long time about the FISIC and the other partnerships in this arena, which are incredibly important to especially our public-private endeavors. I am also an adjunct at Columbia, so a little of this for Columbia overall at CEPA in their capstone program. So thanks for having me. I'll just add a few points to the points that Leslie and John made, and really an emphasis on ransomware here as we're seeing that threat increase. And it's actually becoming, it's almost like ransomware for a service now. Anywhere from $10 to $3,000 an attacker can get in the game. And so when you can go buy capabilities and on the street, so to speak, you can really do some damage. And importantly, it's evolving from small game stakes to actually what we'd call big game hunting. And so you'll see more stories in the headlines about significant companies with wide reach with clients and customers and processing of data that are actually coming under ransomware attack. And we're looking at costs anywhere up to $20 billion to organizations as a whole. And that's a number that we're seeing looking out to even 2021. So ransomware has become a big problem. I think also as you think about where ransomware is targeting, and more often than not, we're seeing it in third parties and suppliers. So it's not necessarily the big financial institution, but it is the vendor that we may rely on for different services and different processes. And just having that data as a treasure trove and a threat, right? Any data exfiltration as a threat can get companies to respond, and they are responding. They are paying these ransoms. The actors have become very smart that insurance policies are actually coming into the calculation. So that extraction and that threat is becoming much more powerful. And then I'll just add one more. We've been focusing on nation states. We've been focusing on cyber criminals. They're now working together. So it's a very powerful threat to have these two actors combining forces. Talk about partnerships. That's a nefarious partnership. And, it's a little something for everyone. The criminals get paid. and the nation states are able to get in and out without attribution. It's very, very hard to really tackle the attribution in these cases. It's never a dull moment, nor a restful night for folks in this industry.
You mentioned third parties, and I wonder, is there a risk that we're focusing too much at the institution level and not on the systemic level for cyber? That is, switches and payment systems, and instead of the institution battening down the hatches, you have to also look at the institution's connections with suppliers, service companies, third parties, to make sure that that's not where the cyber risk comes in.
Absolutely. You couldn't be more spot on. It was always third party risk, fourth party risk. We're now really having to endeavor into what's being called nth party risk, because of this, and supply chain concerns aren't new. This isn't new per se, right? It's really just tactics. It's being able to really get to the heart of the question of data processing functions and that systemic impact. So absolutely, I think, as I think about my role, I'm as much advocating for the enterprise as I am for the system, because especially as critical infrastructure, you can't do one without the other. And the system, I think we have a benefit of having some organizations, one in particular, the Financial Systemic Analysis and Resiliency Center, which is the FSARC, which is an organization of financial institutions that have come together. They're deemed critical infrastructure by the government. But looking at this real question, David, of how do we do the analysis at the enterprise level to fortify the system? Wholesale payments, great example of these companies coming together, looking at the wholesale payment system, its vulnerabilities, and then taking back a remediation plan into each enterprise to shore up the gaps. So there's a lot of work that's being done in that space.
Great, thanks. And Randy, we've seen how broad-minded Columbia is to have an NYU professor on the panel. So your thoughts on cyber risks and DFS?
Thanks, David. Actually, I have been an adjunct at Columbia, so there's a little bit of a homecoming here. But downtown is better. I'm Randy Milch. I'm a professor of practice at NYU Law School, NYU School of Law, and co-chair of the Center for Cybersecurity there. And I come to academia late after many years in the private sector as the general counsel and head of public policy at Verizon, where, among other things, cybersecurity was in my bailiwick. I think it's very interesting. There's obviously this wonderful panel. It's the other folks on this wonderful panel are very, very at the cutting edge of cyber risk. I think it's important to recognize that the effort to increase the reach of cyber products, inevitably falls into the increase of the network and the increase of the attack surface that we're going to have, right? I mean, this whole effort to make sure that wholesale payments are increased, that global reach, global availability is increased. You're only as strong as your weakest link in these efforts, and people are being interconnected is a great benefit and a great risk at the same time from a cyber perspective. And I think that we have to recognize that and recognize the protections that we can try to build in as we build these connections. I also think that it's interesting that there's all sorts of on the higher end, what I would consider the higher end from a resource perspective, lots of family offices, private wealth management, private equity firms that the sophistication of their financial efforts on behalf of their customers seems to be outstripping the sophistication of their cybersecurity capabilities. We had the Nord Fund incident earlier this year. $10 million loan goes awry, from which was basically on a business email compromise, which we have traditionally associated with the lower end of sophistication in financially and from cybersecurity. So I think that there are lots of pockets here of what I would consider digital financial services that don't get the benefit of the investment and regulatory scrutiny that the very large companies, like MasterCard, like JP Morgan, that they're not investing in it, right? So, and if things are interconnected in that front, again, the attack surface is large, and the dangers of interconnectedness, which is really the essential danger of the internet, subsists in those areas as well.
So it sounds like, that raises a couple of issues. One is COVID, now that we're trying to expand financial services digitally, maybe to deal with COVID-related problems with people wanting to be distant from each other, is that expanding the attack surface in ways that we haven't seen before? And then add on to that complexity, the developing world, where we also have some challenges of even having enough cyber professionals to do the work that needs to be done. Are we seeing greater threats? And if so, how can we respond to those threats? And that's Randy, to you and to the panel.
Well, I'll take a first stab. I think that certainly the dispersal of work and the greater amount of work being done at a distance, I don't think there's any way you can conceive of it not having increased the attack surface, right? It's just a matter of, it's almost physics. So I don't know any other way around that. I think to the benefit, many large corporations had an infrastructure for distant work, and so a lot of people have worked very hard to increase their capabilities associated with more people being distant and more work being done distantly. So I think there has been some upkeep there. I would point out that we talk about the less developed world having a paucity of cyber talent. The developed world has a paucity of cyber talent as well. So I'm not sure that I think that there's an old rule about majoring on the majors. You have to start spending the money where the risk is the greatest most immediately. And I think that in the developed world there is the funding to do that. Although in a straightened, if our current economic downturn is not V-shaped, traditionally, in many places, cybersecurity might be somewhere close to the front of the chopping block on a budget standpoint, if history has any hold on this analysis, right? It's a cost center; it's not a profit center, and for all the hard work of the people on this panel and call who work every day to make sure that their entities are safe. I'm sure they all remember and can cite instances in the past in which, or know people where cybersecurity got hit when the budget got hit.
Right, except for then when there's a successful attack, and it goes to the same game of who spending more on this. But other panelists want to jump in on this.
Yeah, I'll make a comment. I think Randy's right in terms of, this attack surface expanded, but those companies that had a modernization plan in tow were the beneficiaries, and in terms of accelerating. The number of individuals that went to VDI systems to work from home, the amount of devices that were added into the mix, so to speak. And so if you were well on your way to modernization, if you had made that investment, and you may have had a plan that was 6 months, 9 months, even a year out, that just accelerated, and very, very quickly. So all the PowerPoints were wiped off very quickly and put to work in the sense of the strategy. I think as we saw, what was happening is it wasn't necessarily the tactics changed. It was just a sheer increase in tactics. So phishing, vishing, smishing, all the ishings you can imagine in terms of taking advantage of fear. And taking advantage of this attack surface. And so we're taking, the technology plus the fear, we just have to be much more alert, but not necessarily the elevation of the activity didn't necessarily change the way we were doing things, I will say, from that perspective.
And John and Leslie, are there technology fixes, new technologies that can help us better protect against cyber threats?
Well, so I would say that, of course, from my standpoint as a technologist, I will always say that we can do a lot in trying to address that. But I think what also gets into a good practice is something I wanted to highlight is an adaptation of NIST practices. NIST stands for National Institute for Standards and Technology on the cybersecurity framework, which is assume security posture of cyber breach at any time and take the strategy to detect using targeted signals for behavior monitoring and machine learning algorithms to proactively detect those potential threats, and then protect across all the endpoints and from sensors to the data center and all the physical parameters, because from a cybersecurity perspective, it's physical as well as virtual and digital space. And so you have to take a more holistic measures in that respect. And then, of course, responding, closing the gaps between discovery and action so that you can respond very quickly in times of attack. And by constantly doing penetration testing and practicing good cyber hygiene is your best insurance measures to make sure that your entire organization is well equipped for that. Now, when it comes down to the high tech area, perhaps on the deep tech space on AI and specific areas of proactive monitoring, there are various mechanisms and tools out there that will kind of give you that capabilities to heighten the security protection and raise the bar for deterrence in order for the hackers to do more work, and therefore they would just move on to the next potential victim. So most organizations are looking into various ways of increasing the cybersecurity capability with various AI and monitoring tools with real-time capabilities, or cryptography for encrypted data in motion and data at rest. And of course, having the audit logs to constantly sift through that in order to determine some of the potential anomaly scenarios that is critical for them to look into. And not to mention, some of them are insider jobs. And having that kind of measures in place to mitigate insider and third-party threats are critical, using various mechanisms such as identity management tools, role-based access, just-in-time access for privilege security, in order to protect your entire organization at an enterprise level against various potential attacks, and proper segmentation of the network and security classifications of your highest, most critical data. So those are all measures that many organizations have put in place, and I think it's various levels of maturity and adoption and practices as well.
Yeah, I wonder if sometimes people forget to look inside at making sure doors are locked, access is restricted, that we think of the external threats, but isn't it true that internal threats can be as great or even greater than external threats sometimes?
That's right.
And John, the credit card industry has done a fantastic job on reducing exposure to fraud. We get those calls and it says this a legitimate transaction. Are there some of those learnings that the credit card industry has done that we can expand throughout the financial system to get better fraud control and cyber risk control? John?
I'm sorry, I can't tell which device is working. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Last time I thought it was the phone. Now I think it's computer. So I don't think I have any specific. So I work with the fraud team, but we have a fusion center where we bring together the fraud and cybersecurity experts. So it's rare for someone to be an expert in both areas, and so I'm not so much on the fraud side. But I will say that increased coordination and awareness throughout the enterprise is key. We instituted a fusion center about 2 years ago, and we took, so cases of fraud or suspected fraud may have taken, of course, we have all kinds of technology to detect it in less than a second, but it's some of the more difficult cases where it may take communication and problem solving across the enterprise. We've got that from days down to hours now, and we've implemented a cybersecurity lab where we can do more forensics internal to, bring information within the company, contain it, and do forensics there. The one piece I was going to say is just really the technology. So we've acquired a lot of technology lately, and we've been doing really well with fraud detection. But it's the people and processes that we forget about a lot, and that's where I think we have to do better. And so just a comment earlier, and Leslie nailed the landing in her previous comments. The one thing I was going to say was that people are always going to be a weakness for us, so we have to keep in mind all these technologies that we implement. There's some great things out there to solve a lot of problems, but to get to that last mile, we really have to focus on people as well.
Yeah, if you put your password on a Post-it on your screen, and there's nothing, all the other protections are just not going to matter anymore. So it's important to be careful. Randy had talked about the supply of cyber professionals around the world. And one issue is how that relates to gender in the field, because I've been in meetings where everyone in the room is male when it comes to cyber. And the question is, can we take advantage of this demand to bring more women into the field? And then I guess a related gender question is, can if digital financial services help bridge the gender gap in terms of who has access to those services? So I wonder if any of the panelists have any thoughts about how we can really take advantage of the situation to change the gender dynamic in the field.
Well, David, if the cloning machine works, we'll deploy that, right? But unfortunately, the reality is that there is significantly fewer women in the cybersecurity professional. And just in STEM alone, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, there are fewer than men in the career. So I am a big advocate in women empowerment, and especially women in technology. Having lived through that and all my life and dealing with some of the challenges, I go out of my way to make sure that we find every avenue to encourage more women to pursue STEM education in school, so that we have a higher intake into the professional field and nurture them over time and provide them role model, and also the opportunity to help them grow in a career path to focus more on technology, and then of course hopefully more in cybersecurity area. I think it's a long pursuit, but nonetheless, it's still something that we need to be aware of to raise the bar and also to help more of the gender balance in these areas. And men are very important to help encourage more women in the workplace to focus more in this space and give the opportunity to help the next generation of women leaders.
Thanks.
I would say this is about opening the aperture to the skills that we need and the training that will therefore be provided. I mean, you think about analytical skills and what competencies look like, and that we're not necessarily just looking to those who've been in the technology world and raised up through that world. There are incredible other amounts of disciplines that bring that same kind of critical thinking and analytics that apply well here.
Right.
I think to echo what Leslie and Katheryn said, the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education, the nice sort of framework that's been put out, has a surprising reliance on interdisciplinary training, right? If you look at the descriptions of the skills necessary for the job descriptions that you would think are entirely technical, every one of those job descriptions understands the regulation, policy, and ethics of data science and cybersecurity. And on the other hand, if you look at the job skills that seem to be entirely non-technical, they all include understand networking, understand protocols, understand hardware. So the cybersecurity game at many levels is really an interdisciplinary one. And coming from the law school, the whole reason I got into the academic side of this was to build a bridge between NYU's School of Law and NYU's Tannen School of Engineering, which is at times is difficult. Sometimes the farmers and the ranchers don't seem to be able to be friends, but I think it's important to try to build those bridges and bring people, have ready for the efforts to increase STEM and increase others, have those positions ready. Partially why we started a new program, a master's degree program at NYU, which is a joint venture between the law school and the engineering school, Masters in Science for Cybersecurity Risk and Strategy. So I think that there are, from what I can tell, and we have a women leaders conference in cybersecurity every year. There's the amount of talent that is there right now is spectacular. It is not enough, and I think that it's bringing people through the system, both on the technical side and the non-technical side, to be interested in this sort of interdisciplinary problem that we have.
Great. So you've touched on sort of law. This is a highly regulated field in many countries where how do we do smart regulation on cybersecurity? I mean, there's a risk of over-regulating, under-regulating, and we also are faced with regulators who may not have an expertise on cyber. There are safety and soundness regulators, prudential regulators, but they're not sophisticated, understandably, on cyber, although they're probably having a steep learning curve. But how would you guide central banks and other regulators on their approach to cybersecurity regulation in the financial services space? And maybe Katheryn, if you want to start.
Sure, I'll jump in. I have a colleague who is a 20-year OCC examiner who likes to constantly remind me that we've been regulating information security for nearly 30 years. This is not new, even though it just feels like in the last couple of years, it's just been this regulatory tsunami globally. And I think that it's the increasing cyber threat, the pace of innovation in technology. I think policymakers and regulators are just considering what their role is here. And they're really trying to figure out how do you mentioned safety and soundness, how do you build resiliency? Where is security? How do you protect customers and their data? And so all of these things come together in this increasingly and fragmented approach to regulation. So a few of the things that are sacrosanct to us, if we think about how do you regulate for safety and soundness and protection. And one is regulations need to be at the principles level, and that's in contrast to something that's really prescriptive. We think that they need to be risk-based. So actions are regulated by what risks the entity takes, what's commensurate with their risk to the enterprise, to their customers, where their place in the system is, as we talked about systemic risk. This really gets to a minimum standards base that can be applied across all size regulated entities. Randy mentioned a number of entities that don't necessarily seem right at the forefront of where all this regulatory pressure should go, but we also have to get to the weakest link where those transmission channels are. So that's the proportionality of it all. We really need to focus on resiliency. So this isn't really a check the box exercise. It really needs to be thoughtful in terms of the context of the business, context of resiliency of operations, having appropriate fallbacks in place, not directing prescriptively what that fallback should be, and really having us to be able to recover in a right and timely way. So as I think about those overall construct and how do we push global frameworks to solve this? I mean, for my company and MasterCard right here, we're global operating models, and more we're seeing fragmentation against borders. Which is challenging to the operating model. It's challenging for a whole number of reasons that we can talk more about. But if you just think about the regulatory environment, there's a great, FISIC was mentioned. There was a survey done by the FISIC, and I think the numbers came out, something to the effect of 40% of CISOs are spending their times on areas of compliance and regulation and not actually fighting the fight on cyber. We have to change that. We have to create an environment where those who are supposed to be fighting in cyber are actually doing that on a daily and minute-by-minute basis. So those are some of my thoughts.
Yeah, so then, I don't know, John, if you have thoughts about that, but how do we align the fight against cyber with the regulatory compliance so it's not an add-on burden, but it's actually being effective and efficient? John, I don't know if you have...
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't hear my name. The audio is a little bit garbled. Yeah, I'd have to agree. So what we've kind of looked at from regulatory perspective is working with regulators. I think Katheryn mentioned this, but oftentimes work at the bleeding edge, and we can help them understand kind of what's happening now and into the future, and help educate them and work with them to make sure that we're more resilient, not that we're just checking boxes. We've also found something that's needed is working with other companies and sharing ideas about how to work with regulators. How do you make this better, and not just get into this, get to the check the box mentality and lock up just to pass the inspections.
Great, Randy.
So we're doing a lot on that front, especially overseas. Yeah.
I think that, you know, we have a disturbing tendency for regulators to go on the field of battle and shoot the wounded. That seems to be a prominent approach, and I think that the financial, if you're a major financial entity and you basically live with your regulator who's constantly pinging you on security, that's one regulatory model that is vastly different than the model that most entities with cybersecurity problem face, right? The regulator is the one that shows up at the end after there's been a breach and exacts further penalty from you. I think that, you know, we have to recognize, I think that in some instances, perversely, significant regulation on the privacy side without a view towards cybersecurity can actually work against cybersecurity. And that's counterintuitive to people because people tend to think of them as the same thing, but privacy and cybersecurity are two very different thoughts, regimes, and ideas. You know, for instance, I think the very recent decision by the European Court of Justice on the so-called Schrems II decision, which is going to, on current course and speed, pretty much break the global flows of information, because I think most people look at that and don't understand how the adequacy, how anyone's going to meet the adequacy decisions of the EU outside of the EU. You know, is a world with lots of data localization safer or less safe? I think a lot of people could argue that it's less safe, that you're going to have a lot of little pots of information that are not going to be adequately defended. So, you know, I think that we need to be smart about regulation, and we need to have regulation that is that is there on the front end, not just on the back end to shoot the wounded. And we need regulation that provides entities with sufficient information to make judgments about how much money to spend for cybersecurity. And I don't think that our current regulatory scheme for those who don't live with their regulators like a major bank would doesn't provide that kind of input that helps a company know what to spend on cybersecurity.
Well, we have just a couple more minutes left, but let me throw in a challenging topic you've touched on just briefly, which is data localization. This trend now of countries saying keep all your data in the country, and basically what it does is, in some cases, deprives companies of access to cloud computing. And is that a cyber win or loss if we force to do it domestically as opposed to using some of the major cloud computing services out there? Don't know if Leslie or Katheryn want to jump in on that.
So I'll comment on that because I've been working in the cloud space for the last 7 to 8 years, and I think people don't go to cloud for cloud's sake, right? They go to cloud because not really more so on the cost side, more on the security side, because most of these cloud, hyperscale cloud players, the big tech I'm talking about, spent significant in the range of billions of dollars on cybersecurity and cyber resiliency and building those capabilities in place that are highly sophisticated. And it would be hard for any individual firms or organizations to build the level of security in place in-house. And so I think that kind of shift the mindset towards cloud, that clouds actually, they've proven and they have done a significant amount of studies to show that they actually have the level of rigors and maturity in technology and people, process, and all the necessary operationalizing of the data security operations to protect the data better than others. So I think that has shifted the conversation. Now, there are still some countries that focus on localization, and there could be the need to localize. I'm not saying that there will be all size fits all. So in some cases, there will be cases where they have to, no choice but to localize some of the critical data and classify them accordingly. But in most cases I've seen, they can really be in the cloud, but they have not gone through the exercise of doing so. But many of the data localization is because of the whole journey to get there. That some of them feel like they're not quite ready for various reasons. The ICT levels of maturity have not caught up yet. So I think over time you see that gradual shift.
Thank you, David. Your panel, of course, has demonstrated the breadth of the challenge of cyber threats and developing cyber resilience in the face of this rapid digitalization of financial services following the outbreak of the pandemic.